wasn't expecting anything extraordinary when I decided to go camping by the lake for the weekend. In fact, I chose this particular spot because it was quiet, secluded, and the perfect place to unwind. It was an old habit from my childhood, a spot my dad used to bring me to when I was younger. No fancy amenities, no crowds, just me, the woods, and a small, serene lake. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Friday, set up my tent by the water's edge, and started a small campfire. The sound of the crackling fire and the soft rustling of leaves were the only noises that accompanied me as I ate and watched the fading sunlight. It was peaceful, a quiet evening that I hadn't realized I needed so badly. The first night passed without a hitch. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping at dawn and the sight of mist hanging over the lake. It was as beautiful as I remembered, a perfect way to disconnect from everything back home. I spent the morning walking around the lake, reminiscing about my childhood, but also feeling a strange sense of solitude that I wasn't used to. The path around the lake was worn down, narrow in some places, but otherwise easy to follow. I lost myself in thought, listening to the rustle of branches above me and the occasional splash of a fish jumping from the water. After a few hours, I took a break on the lake's edge, letting my legs dangle into the cool water as I stared out into the vast wilderness. That's when I saw the first set of footprints. At first, I thought they were my own. Maybe I'd walked past that spot earlier, but then I realized I was looking at fresh tracks, barefoot. The prints weren't large, more like a woman's or a child's. What struck me as odd was how the footprints led toward the water, but stopped right at the edge, as if the person had been watching the lake and then just turned back. There were no signs of them going into the water, and no footprints leading further around the shore. It was unsettling, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone had been here before me. After all, it wasn't that remote, even though it felt like I was the only one around. As I circled the lake again, my thoughts kept returning to those prints. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was nearby, someone I hadn't seen yet. It wasn't paranoia. Well, maybe it was, but the unease was real. As I continued walking, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone hiding just out of sight. The day passed, and I found myself back at my camp around dusk, lighting the fire and trying to relax. I told myself I was overthinking things. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, coming from the direction of the tree line. My head snapped up. I tried to focus, listening for any sounds of movement, but there was nothing. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer. Footsteps, definitely more than one person, moving slowly but deliberately. I stood up, my heart pounding, unsure whether I should call out or wait. The fire crackled in the silence, the only noise between me and the unknown. Then, just beyond the light of the campfire, I saw them. A man and a woman, walking side by side. The man was taller, broad-shouldered, but neither of them moved with any urgency. They walked slowly, as though they were casually strolling. But what unsettled me wasn't just the timing of their arrival. It was the fact that neither of them seemed to notice me. They just walked, their backs to the fire. I stood frozen. Was it possible they hadn't seen me? I opened my mouth to speak, but froze when I saw something strange. The man wasn't wearing shoes. He was barefoot, just like the footprints I had seen earlier. I called out to them, "Hey, can I help you?" Without saying a word, The woman turned sharply and sprinted back into the woods. Her movement was sudden, too quick to make sense of. She was gone before I could blink. The man, however, didn't react. He didn't even turn around to look at her. He just continued walking into the darkness, his steps slow and deliberate. For a moment, I just stood there, staring into the empty space where they had been. The fire flickered, casting long shadows, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My instincts told me to leave, but my legs were frozen in place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made myself move. I quickly packed my gear, throwing everything into my backpack and securing the tent. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The idea of those strange people wandering in the woods, barefoot and silent, sent chills down my spine. I had to go. The path leading out wasn't too difficult to follow, but in the growing darkness, every sound felt amplified. A branch snapped behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I kept walking faster, glancing over my shoulder more than I'd like to admit. The woods had fallen completely silent, not a single bird or insect making a sound. The weight of the silence hung heavy in the air. About 30 minutes into my walk, I heard it. Footsteps, closer now, behind me, running. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. The footsteps were coming from somewhere behind me, but every time I turned, I saw nothing. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart. I pushed forward, trying to outrun whatever was following me. A few more minutes passed, and the footsteps were closer still. Then, suddenly, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I didn't stop moving. I just kept going, the panic rising in my chest. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I broke through the trees and reached the road where my truck was parked. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was behind me. I jumped in the truck, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could. As I drove, my mind raced. What had I seen? Who were they? I couldn't explain it, and honestly, I didn't want to. All I knew was that whatever I had experienced that night wasn't normal. The feeling of being watched, the bare footprints, the eerie encounter with those strange people, it didn't sit right with me. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm sure I'll never go back to that lake again. Sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder if they were real. I wonder if they were something else, something not entirely human. But I'll never know for sure. One thing's for certain. I'll never go back to that lake. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote part of Montana. I'd found a barely documented trail that led to an abandoned ranger lookout built sometime in the 1960s. Unlike popular hikes with wide-open trails, this one was buried deep into the national forest, so far out that there wasn't even cell service for hours before reaching it. From what little information I gathered online, the tower hadn't been maintained for decades, and the few people who managed to reach it mostly advised against staying overnight. But that's exactly what made it so appealing to me. I wanted the isolation, the raw experience of being alone in the wilderness. I packed 2 days' worth of food, water, my tent in case the lookout was unusable, a flashlight, batteries, my knife, and a heavy jacket. By noon, I left my truck hidden in a shallow clearing off a dirt road and started the 6-mile hike. The trail, if you could call it that, was almost invisible in places. Bushes had overtaken most of the path, and fallen trees forced me to zigzag constantly. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. It was like the forest swallowed sound itself. No cars, no planes, even the birds felt sparse. By the time I reached the lookout, my clothes were soaked with sweat, and the sun was already starting to dip low. I stood at the base of it, catching my breath, staring up. The tower was old. Rust streaks ran down the metal frame, and the steps up the narrow staircase looked sketchy at best. Still, the main structure up top seemed intact. I cautiously climbed, each step groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I found a small, square room with shattered windows on all sides. There were broken chairs, some empty metal shelves, and old ranger logs scattered on the floor, pages half rotted and chewed through by bugs. After checking to make sure the floor could hold my weight, I unrolled my sleeping bag in a corner. I wasn't stupid enough to trust it fully, though. I kept my bag packed and ready to move at a moment's notice. As the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, a deep cold began to set in. I heated some canned food on my little stove, ate quickly, then sat on the edge of the platform, watching the forest vanish into darkness. At first, it was peaceful, just the faint whisper of wind and the creaking of old wood. But then I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air. Something smoky. Not the fresh scent of a campfire, but something older, heavier, like smoldering wood that had been burning for hours. It was faint, drifting on the wind, and I thought maybe a fire had started somewhere far off. I pulled out my flashlight and scanned the forest below. Nothing. Just endless blackness between the skeletal outlines of trees. Trying to shake off the unease, I crawled back inside and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, knife tucked close to my side. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. I hadn't heard anything, not exactly, but it felt like something had changed, like the air itself had gotten heavier. Slowly, I sat up and listened. At first, silence. Then, a soft clink. Clink, clink. Metal on metal. I froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps on the metal staircase outside. I switched off my flashlight instantly, plunging the room into darkness. Whoever, or whatever, was outside hadn't used a flashlight themselves. No light. No sound except the occasional metal groan from the stairs. I held my breath as I listened. The steps stopped right beneath the platform. For what felt like an eternity, there was no sound. Then I heard something soft, a dragging, scraping noise, like fingertips brushing slowly along the outer walls. Circling. I stayed frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, quietly, a hand pressed against one of the broken windows. Just a shadow, just an outline, but it was unmistakable. A second later, the hand slipped away, and everything went dead silent again. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Maybe more. I barely dared to breathe. Finally, I dared to move, inching toward the trapdoor that led to the stairs. I had no plan, no idea what I was doing, just the primal urge to survive. I cracked the door open just a sliver and listened. Nothing. I decided to make a run for it. Gripping my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, I bolted down the stairs, not caring how loud I was. Every step felt like it would snap under me, but somehow I made it down without falling. I hit the ground running, flashlight darting wildly over the trees as I plunged into the forest. I didn't dare look back. It was chaos trying to navigate through the woods in the dark. I tripped, scratched my arms and face, tore my jacket. But I kept running until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Finally, after what felt like forever, I stumbled back onto the overgrown trail. I turned off my flashlight, crouched in the bushes, and listened. In the distance, far, far too close, I heard a faint whistle. A long, slow, tuneless whistle, like someone calling out in the dark. I stayed there until the first light of dawn started bleeding into the sky. Only then did I dare to move again. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't waste a second. I threw my gear into the passenger seat and sped off, bouncing down the dirt road without even closing the back hatch. I never found out who or what was at the lookout with me that night. And I never went back. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the trees as I pulled off the winding coastal road. My van bounced slightly as I veered down the uneven dirt path leading into the woods. I loved the freedom of traveling alone, of escaping the noise of cities. There was something about the isolation of the forest that calmed me. It was the middle of fall, the air crisp and cold, with the scent of pine all around. I hadn't seen anyone in miles, which was exactly what I wanted. This stretch of road was rarely traveled, and the campsites along it were even rarer. Perfect for someone like me who needed quiet to think. I found a small, secluded clearing surrounded by dense pines. It was just large enough to park my van and stretch out. No one else had been here for a while. The ground was covered in fallen needles, and there were no tire tracks in the dirt. I parked the van and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift for just a moment. The rain, which had been threatening all day, finally began to fall in soft, steady droplets, tapping against the roof of the van. I settled in, cooking a simple meal on my small propane stove. It was cozy inside the van, the rain pattering softly on the metal roof. After eating, I opened the side door a crack, letting in the cool air. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the droplets slide down the window as I scrolled through my phone, checking the weather and looking for something to pass the time. I noticed a movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees near the clearing. I froze for a moment, straining to see better. Nothing. It was probably just a deer, I thought, or the wind moving the branches, but something about it felt wrong. I shook it off, returning to my phone, but the feeling lingered. Night had settled in, the storm picking up in intensity. The wind howled through the trees, and I could hear the distant crack of thunder. I turned on a show on my laptop, trying to distract myself. But as I sat there, a sudden flash of light outside caught my attention. It wasn't headlights, and it wasn't from the campfire I'd left burning. It was more like a glow, faint and blue, flickering in the woods just past the van. I pulled the curtains back, leaning toward the window to see better, but the light was gone. I checked the trees and the path. Nothing seemed out of place. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it impossible to hear anything clearly. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. I shook my head, trying to focus on the show again. But then I heard it. Soft footsteps crunching in the wet leaves outside, just outside the sliding door. My heart rate quickened. It wasn't the wind. Someone was out there. I quickly closed the window cover and sat still, waiting. The sound of footsteps moved around the van, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then there was a knock, light but sharp. The kind of knock that makes you freeze in place. It came from the side door. My mind raced. Who could it be? It was so late, and no one had been around when I arrived. I was miles from the nearest town. Maybe it was someone lost, trying to find their way. But why come to my van? I kept still, barely breathing, wondering if they'd leave. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. It was a man's voice, but it was muffled, like he was talking through the door. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" I didn't respond, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice called again, this time more urgently. "I'm from the park service. Are you all right in there? You need to open up. It's not safe out here at night." My stomach dropped. I didn't believe it for a second. No one from the park service would be out here, especially not in this storm. It had been hours since I had seen anyone on the road. And even if he was telling the truth, why knock like that? Why didn't he just identify himself properly? I didn't speak, didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound of rain, the occasional crack of thunder, and then silence. For a moment, I thought he'd left. But then, just outside the van, I heard the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the metal side. It was deliberate. Someone was trying to find a way in. I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. There was no way I could stay hidden forever. The door was locked. But what if he wasn't alone? What if there were more of them? My hand instinctively went to the small pocket knife I kept in my bag, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. The scraping stopped, and then the voice came again. "I know you're in there. Please, open the door. I don't want to have to break it down. It's for your own safety." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached over, grabbed my keys, and started the van. I slammed it into drive, the engine roaring to life. Just as I put my foot on the gas, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps pounding toward the back of the van. I didn't look. I couldn't. The tires spun on the wet dirt as I gunned it, fishtailing for a moment before gaining traction. The van shot forward, and I was out of the clearing, speeding back down the trail. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my hands trembling. Nothing. No figures chasing me, no headlights. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, pulling into a well-lit gas station. My heart still raced as I parked the van and quickly locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty road, wondering if I had just escaped something far worse than I could imagine. The sheriff's department confirmed that no Park Service officer had been out there, and there were no reported incidents in the area. They chalked it up to someone possibly messing with me. But I knew better. The way they moved, the way they spoke. It wasn't just some prank. I've been careful where I camp ever since. I've learned that even the most remote places can hide the darkest secrets.